to our first Google Hangout of the course with Professor Eric Foner. We are broadcasting live from the Columbia Center for Teaching and Learning. If you'd like to ask a question, click on the grid icon in the upper right of your screen and you will see a QA button. And if we can't get to your question tonight, post it into the discussion forum in edX. So without further ado, Professor Eric Foner.
Hi, thank you, Michael. And yeah, I'm happy to be here to respond to any questions from people taking part in this MOOC on the coming of the Civil War. So let us start. We'll start with the first one. This is from Catherine. Okay. Here in the UK, we have the British. She's in the UK. Okay. We have the British National Archives. Can I ask if there's a similar facility in the US with online access? You know, Catherine, I am old enough to remember when the British National Archives was called the Public Record Office, and when it was located in Chancery Lane in Britain in the 1970s. I did research there. Now it's out in Kew, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, yes, the equivalents in the US, which are definitely worth looking at for their online resources, are the National Archives, which is the repository of government documents, which is an immense amount, and then the Library of Congress, which has an incredible collection of online resources on every conceivable thing related to American history. So I think if you look at those two websites, the National Archives and the Library of Congress, you will find plenty of food for thought, plenty of resources, and you know, it's really a great thing for people all over the world to be able to access this. Okay, let's go to the next one. How do we view the Civil War today? Have there been other interpretations since the revisionist? Isn't it fascinating that as the time passes, truth changes? Well, your last comment there is moving us into the realm of what we call postmodernism, where truth is kind of up for grabs or changeable or fungible. Certainly interpretation is. Truth, I don't know. Historians don't talk about truth all that much anymore. We talk about interpretations. And yes, of course, there's always different interpretations of the Civil War, although my view, as I said in the class, is that there are basically two interpretations. One is the needless war, that somehow the United States blundered into a conflict which was unnecessary for one reason or another. And the other is, to borrow the phrase from Senator William Seward, the irrepressible conflict, that there was a fundamental conflict between North and South, between slave and free societies, and that eventually this led to war. Now, of course, there are millions of permutations of each of those two. I would say that what we see now is, again, a conflict between two views. The irrepressible conflict view is very prominent, let's say, in the works of James Oakes, who's published several books lately, and Sean Wilentz, whose book on the history of American democracy. My own writings probably fall into that category. But there is a growing, you might say, you know, a different point of view about that the war was unnecessary. And I think I said in class, this really, I think, stems out of the Iraq War, the sense that war is kind of pointless anyway, that politicians use, you know, high-class language about freedom and other things to glorify war, which is really just a lot of mass slaughter. So a kind of cynicism about war in our time translates back into a cynicism about the Civil War, which is not unusual because, as I've emphasized, every historian has one eye on the present and one eye on the past, or maybe both eyes on the present sometimes. So views of the coming of the Civil War will continue to change, but whether we are actually going around in a circle or coming up with new ideas, I haven't seen any really new perspectives on this for a good while. It seems like almost everything has been said already, and we're just kind of recycling it in one or another form. Okay, let's see. I know women didn't have the vote yet, or political power, certainly true. Is there any information about how women, North and South, felt about the Civil War? Yeah, that is certainly the case, that women are not as active in the historical record as men were at that time. I would have to venture to say, but there are books about women North and South. Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, wrote some important books before going on to that exalted position about women in the South. Stephanie McCurry wrote a very good book, Confederate Reckoning, which deals with poorer women in the South and their growing sense that they were suffering too much from the war because their husbands were drafted away and they couldn't really run these farms by themselves. In the North, Nina Silber has written a book called Daughters of the Union about the mobilization of Northern women to support the war effort. I think on both sides, women's views were pretty much, patriotic within the context of their society. But certainly there is a sense with Faust and McCurry and others that in the South, war weariness began to take its toll on women's consciousness, on women's morale during the war. Faust went so far as to say that really it was the sort of defection of upper class women who just basically felt it was not worth the struggle. There was too much sacrifice, too much problem that undermined the Confederate war effort on the home front. So there certainly are many books about women and their views, the North and South. And then I should not neglect to say there's a lot of work about slave women and how they experienced the process of emancipation, of civil war, both for the good and the bad. There was tremendous violence against blacks in the South as slavery disintegrated, a good bit of it directed against women, but there were those who seized the opportunity to grab their freedom by running away to Union lines and that sort of thing. So gender has become a much more important feature of writing on the Civil War than it was, let us say, when I was a student a good while ago. Are you working on a new book, and what is the topic? Good question. No, I'm not actually at the moment. I published a book in January called Gateway to Freedom, which is about the Underground Railroad, particularly in New York City. So that's not even a year ago, and I'm still kind of out on the hustings giving lectures promoting that book. I think after next semester I'm teaching. When that's over, I will devote some time to thinking about another project, but I actually don't have one right now, which is kind of relaxing, actually, in a way. Okay. Let's go to the next. All right. I know the question is off the topic. What about the GOP debate tonight? Yeah, in an hour from now or so, the GOP, the next GOP debate, the 2016 presidential campaign. How different are modern campaigns from those preceding the Civil War? Well, they could not be more different. I mean, in a way, what my opinion is of the presidential debate of the Republicans is not a historical question. As a citizen, I have opinions, but that's no different, better or worse than anyone else's. Today presidential debates have become a celebrity or it's like a reality show basically on TV. The whole purpose is to kind of catch someone up. The moderator comes up with these questions trying to catch somebody out with some misstatement or contradiction. And then the press, oh, look at this, so-and-so said this now, but 2 months ago he said that. Is that the way to judge whether a person is competent to be president? I don't think so. In the pre-Civil War period, political parties were tremendously powerful, much more so than today. You could never have had a guy like Donald Trump, let us say, or Carson just waltzing in from the outside with no political experience. I'm not saying they're not worthy candidates, but no political experience, no office holding, no real connection to the party, and suddenly becoming major, leading the polls. No, back then it was the party that really was much more important than any individual candidate or any individual aspirant. The parties stood for very clear platforms. Of course, they had divisions just like today, but the parties had very clear positions and debates. Well, in a few weeks, we'll get to the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. Those were debates. What we have today is not debates. It's just some stupid moderator throwing questions up at candidates. Lincoln and Douglas debated. The first guy spoke for an hour. The second guy got up and spoke for an hour and a half. And the first one then had a half an hour of rebuttal. That is a debate. No moderator was asking them questions. Nobody was trying to trip them up except each other. They had the opportunity to really put forward very detailed explanations of what they stood for, what they believed, what they would do. And thousands of people attended in Illinois, some small town in Illinois, 10, 12,000 people, farmers, artisans, urban craftsmen came to hear these debates. So people had a longer attention span back then They didn't have as many alternative forms of entertainment as we do today. So campaigns were entirely different. But the main point is it was the party that ran the campaign. People voted for the party as much as for any individual. And it's not really the case that much in the US anymore like that. All right. If the slaves, let's see, this comes from, let's see, Jose Diaz. Okay. If the slaves were property of the owners, were the owners responsible to make sure the slaves were medically sound? I would hope so. Well, you know, first of all, medicine at that period was pretty primitive to begin with. So to be medically sound was not so simple. Obviously, slave owners, as owners of human property, had a vested interest in the survival of their slaves. The slaves were there to labor. An ill slave can't labor as well. An injured slave can't labor as well. A slave who dies is a loss of property from the point of view of the owner. And so, yes, on big plantations, owners provided medical care for ill slaves. But medical care then was so primitive that it wasn't necessarily a benefit to get medical care. And in fact, there were plenty of instances where when illness struck the owner's family, they would sometimes go, slave communities had these kind of healers. They weren't trained doctors, obviously, but people who, coming from African traditions, knew how to use herbs and other things to maybe combat disease. And sometimes white owners would seek out slave healers when conventional medicine didn't, do the trick. So, but then if you get, most slaves were actually, well, about half the slaves were living on plantations and half, or maybe a little less, on smaller farms. On small farms, there was probably no medical care. A small farmer with 3 or 4 slaves is not going to be able to get a doctor in, probably couldn't afford it. So, for everybody. And then, there were places like the Mississippi Valley where cholera was a major problem in this period. Yellow fever was rife in New Orleans and places like that. There were these tropical diseases that were quite devastating in certain parts of the South, not so much the upper South, but in the lower South, which is near the, more the tropical zone. So, this is a subject which has been studied by people, but the main point is medical care didn't actually get you very far in the 1850s in the United States. Do you think there's still a case for payments to be made as a result of slavery? Should countries be held to account? Reparations is what this question is about, right? And that's been a political issue for a while. In fact, for a long while. After the end of the Civil War, if you stick it out to our Reconstruction course down the road, slaves wanted land. They demanded land. They demanded the famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule. They didn't use the word reparations back then, but that was the idea. We have worked for years, for generations on this land for no compensation. We have created the wealth of the South. We have made this land valuable. We demand payment for our previous labor. That's a kind of reparations. Lincoln himself, in his second inaugural address in March 1865, talked about the 250 years of unrequited toil, unpaid labor of the slaves. And implicitly, he's raised, what is the requirement of justice for 250 years of stolen labor? So that issue was out there. Of course, nothing was done in Reconstruction. In the 1890s, there was a movement in the South for what they called pensions for former slaves. Union soldiers were getting pensions. Former slaves are now getting much older. They demanded pensions from the federal government. They didn't get that either. In the 1920s, Marcus Garvey, the black leader, demanded reparations. Today, it's on the agenda. Caribbean nations are asking for reparations from England, from France, from the colonial countries for the devastation wrought by colonialism and slavery there in the past. So, it's kind of on the agenda, but it's a political issue. It's not a historical issue. And what you think about it depends on how you think social policy ought to be developed. The closest analogy in the world today to reparations for slavery actually is the payments that Germany pays every year to Israel. Okay, every year Germany, there's a German word for this, which I don't know. They give significant payments to the state of Israel. Why? They're not buying anything from Israel. This is a reparation for the Holocaust, but it's not to victims of the Holocaust necessarily. It's to people. It's to the Jewish people. Plenty of people in Israel have nothing to do with the Holocaust, no connection to the Holocaust, no family, nothing, but they would still benefit from these payments. So people who are demanding reparations in the U.S. are saying black people in general should get this. It's not just whether your ancestor was a slave or not. It's a people. And so if one thinks that's a good idea in Germany and Israel, one could say, well, yeah, it's earlier in the U.S., but the justice question is still the same. But, as I say, it's a political question. It's not a historical question. And frankly, I don't think it's ever going to happen. White people in this country are not going to pay a lot of money to black people because of slavery. It just is not in the cards. That's what can I say? Another off the top. We're off the topic. That's all right. I'll chat about anything, but history I also enjoy. Can you elaborate on the slavery issue of Native Americans? Well, that's not off the topic in a certain sense. Not at all. Native Americans were part of the American population in the period before the Civil War. By the 1850s, the so-called civilized tribes, a white term, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, etc., had been removed in the 1830s and 40s from their homelands in Georgia and Alabama and Florida, Mississippi, moved out to Oklahoma to be put on reservations. There were still plenty of Native Americans out in the Midwest, past the Mississippi River and Kansas and further west in the Northwest, the Pacific Coast. Some Native Americans had slavery, no question about it. The Cherokee had slaves. The Seminole actually were a refuge in Florida. Slaves who escaped from Georgia would find refuge with the Seminole in Florida. That's one of the reasons the U.S. government wanted to get the Seminole out of there. So that played a role in the sectional conflict. The whole issue of fugitive slaves involves Indians to some extent because some Indians are providing refuge to fugitive slaves. So, Native Americans, and just like any other group, they fight among themselves. There was no particular unity among them. Some of them were giving help to slaves. Some of them were holding slaves on their own. But the problem is the general tendency at this time is toward the removal of natives to the West. And in fact, the Republican Party, this is the great irony. A guy like Lincoln, for example, who was a humanitarian and didn't hate Indians the way many people on the frontier did, but their vision of the West was small white farmers. The free labor vision was people moving from the East, taking up farms. And they didn't say it in these words, but that presupposed the removal of the Indians. That land is occupied by Indians. How are you going to have homesteaders going out there unless you remove the Indians from possession of that land? So the very concept of free labor in the West presupposes excluding the Native Americans. So that's a contradiction that Lincoln and many others never quite came to terms with. All right, let's see. After the Civil War was over and the racism ran rampant in the South, were there any ex-slave owners who still had their slaves as workers get into legal trouble for the conditions murder? All right, well, yes, this is again a future course down the road. After the Civil War, most former slaves probably ended up going back to work for their former owners. They did not get the land they wanted to be independent farmers. Some of them moved to some other plantation or to cities, but a lot of them, most of them probably had to work for wages or share of the crop on plantations that former owners. They were no longer slaves. There were many things that could not be done to them. They couldn't be bought and sold, obviously. They couldn't be whipped. Their children could go to school instead of having to work in the fields. So, but there was tremendous violence against the freed people. And yes, there were the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency set up by the federal government, was there to try to oversee all this. It was very difficult. But they would punish planters who broke their contracts or committed violence against former slaves. Once you get the Reconstruction governments set up where black people have a major voice, then people who commit acts of violence against black people or anyone else can be brought to trial, and were. Now, it was very difficult. The violence was rampant. You had groups like the Ku Klux Klan and others running amok, but certainly there were efforts to prevent this kind of maltreatment, although in many places it was very difficult to do that. All right, what about free blacks who were slave owners? How common was it? Was it mostly to have a workforce or protect family members? Good question, very good question. There were black slave owners, not a hell of a lot, but there were some. Some of them, a few of them, were big plantation owners. In Louisiana, there was a guy named Antoine Dubuclet who owned over 100 slaves. In South Carolina, there's a book called Black Masters about the Ellison family, blacks who owned slaves in South Carolina. As the question sort of suggests, most black people who owned slaves, it was members of their own family, like they had purchased them. A free man married to a slave woman could purchase our freedom maybe, or purchase the freedom of the children. Why would they do that? Well, the thing is that in the law of most southern states by this time, slaves can be freed. There's no possibility, but they have to leave the state if they're freed. And so in the case I just mentioned, a man might buy his wife or children, but he didn't want to free them exactly because they'd all have to leave the state. So most of this was actually people owning, in legal terms, members of their own family. But there were a few who actually owned significant workforces. One shouldn't make too much of this. I mean, obviously, the vast, vast majority were white owners, but there were, the law, free blacks were able to own property. Slaves were property. So there were some who owned slaves. Okay, this week we're investigating anti-immigration feelings in the 1850s. How does this, at that time, compare with the anti-immigration movement today? Has there ever been a pro-immigration period in American history? Well, the thing is, these things go almost at the same time. Yeah, there have been plenty of pro-immigration periods, often at the same time as the anti-immigration periods. Different groups in American society want or don't want significant numbers of immigrants. For example, today, as you mentioned, there is strong anti-immigrant sentiment in some quarters. President Trump, Donald Trump launched his campaign, became prominent with denunciations of Mexicans, so-called crossing the border, rapists, murderers, and all that. But there's plenty of people, agricultural employers, Chamber of Commerce, many others who want immigrants to come in today and are very unhappy about the anti-immigrant sentiment. The 1850s is comparable. The know-nothings, the anti-immigrant, then it was not Mexicans or Central Americans, it was Irish they were complaining about, Irish Catholics coming in very large numbers because of the famine over there. And what really alarmed native-born American Protestants was their religion, Roman Catholic, and also their growing political influence in cities like New York and Boston. Back then in many places, you didn't even have to be a citizen to vote. You could vote as soon as you got here. And the Irish immigrants were becoming very prominent in political power in these cities. So yeah, there have been periods of intense anti-immigrant sentiment. Another one is the 1920s, when the law of 1924 just cut off immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as all of Asia. So that was a period of tremendous nativism. I guess you'd say the 1960s, when the 1965 Hart-Celler law was passed, which reformed immigration processes considerably, was more of a pro-immigration era. We're schizophrenic about this in the United States. It's very common to say we're a nation of immigrants, right? You hear that phrase all the time. But we don't want any more. We're a nation of immigrants, but let's close the door so no more immigrants come in. That's a kind of common sentiment out there. But it's always been controversial, and I guess it will continue to be so. Since the South supplied cotton and tobacco to the North, was it against the economic interests of the Northern industry to support the Civil War? Excellent question. Sometimes people looking at the Civil War say, oh, well, the North was getting industrialized and the South was agricultural. That's why they had a war. There's no law that says industry and agriculture have to go to war with each other. Most countries have agricultural regions and industrial regions. They don't have civil wars. In fact, in some ways, the slave system and the Northern system were quite integrated with each other. As was said, the cotton, tobacco, less important at this point. The cotton goes into British factories, but also Northern factories making textiles. Northern bankers are financing the expansion of slavery. Northern merchants, particularly New York City, are controlling the cotton trade. There were a lot of Northerners with vested economic interest in slavery. That is absolutely true. That's a good point. We will get to that in a few weeks. Those groups tended to favor compromise with the South. They tended to favor giving in to Southern demands in order to keep the Union together. So in the secession crisis, for example, a train full of the most important merchants and industrialists of New York City went down to Washington, dozens and dozens of them, to lobby Congress to make concessions to the South in order to get them to stay in the Union. However, once the Civil War broke out, they all became extremely avid backers of the war, because now that there was no more negotiation, the only way to keep the South in was by war. And so they became very bellicose and supportive of the Union war effort, but for the same reason. They did not want their economic ties with the South to be severed. So one should not think of this as one economic system severed from another economic system going to war. They were very closely integrated. This is why Abraham Lincoln, talked about slavery when he said he didn't call it Southern slavery, he called it American slavery, because the whole country was complicitous in the institution of slavery in some ways. If slavery was important enough to start a war among the states, why we're not doing the same thing today? The U.S. is regarded as the policeman of the world. There are more slaves in the world than any time in history, 36 million. Is that true? I don't know that statistic. I'm not going to say it's incorrect. Well, I don't personally believe the United States is the policeman of the world, frankly, and I hope we're not. This was a recipe for endless war, which we're actually in now anyway. We're in a war in about 7 or 8 different countries right now, despite the fact that our president received the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. Very odd behavior for a peace advocate. But anyway, we're bombing in Syria and Yemen and everywhere. Iraq now again, we're back in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, the war did not start as a war over slavery. This is the irony. The war was fundamentally caused by differences over slavery. But it did not start as a war against slavery. It started as a war to preserve the Union. Again, this is down the road in the next course on the Civil War itself, how it is transformed from a war for the Union to a war for emancipation. That takes 2 years. If there are 36 million slaves in the world today, it's a disgraceful fact. And, that's what the United Nations was set up for after World War II, to try to be a place where international principles of human rights could be articulated and enforced. I don't believe it's the role of the United States to do this all by ourselves. But if there are places where human rights are being so egregiously violated, then the United Nations ought to figure out a way of dealing with that. So, yeah, it is certainly, unfortunately, true that slavery does exist in the world in various forms, in various places, and that is something that ought to concern any, forward-looking person. Did the concern about having to compensate slave owners for their property, slaves, prevent a peaceful end to slavery? Well, the answer is no. Unfortunately, there was no peaceful end to slavery. That's the one thing you discover as you study this period. Lincoln, in the beginning of the Civil War, offered to the South exactly what is being proposed here: gradual emancipation, monetary compensation to the owners, and he added in as a kicker, let's get the slaves out of here altogether, send them back to Africa. or send them to Central America, as we know you don't want a whole lot of free Negroes. He offered this to the border states, the slave states that stayed in the Union. He offered it to the Confederate states. He started off offering it to Delaware. Delaware had 1,800 slaves, nothing. Lincoln said, Delaware can be that's where Biden comes from, Delaware. Delaware can be the state that launches emancipation. We're going to give you money, compensation right here. 1,800, what's the big deal? What did Delaware say? Forget it, Lincoln, we're not interested. We do not want your money. You don't understand, Lincoln. We are slave owners. We want our slaves. We do not want the money. That's a different thing. They rejected it. Kentucky, everybody rejected it. If Delaware, with 1,800 slaves, will not consider compensated emancipation, you tell me how you're going to get rid of slavery in Mississippi or in South Carolina or in Georgia with hundreds of thousands of slaves. Nope. Unfortunately, the slave owners were adamant that they wanted their slaves, not the money, the slaves. So compensated emancipation was never going to work. It's too bad in a way. I mean, I'm not a believer in war. Of course, the abolitionists were opposed to this. They said slavery is illegitimate. It's not a legitimate form of property. Property in human beings is illegitimate. Therefore, they should not be paid. But Lincoln said, no, we'll pay them. But nobody wanted to take the money because that would mean giving up slaves, and they weren't willing to do that. So if someone could show me a peaceful route to the end of slavery, I would say, okay, maybe the Civil War wasn't necessary, but I have never seen a plausible scenario for peacefully getting rid of slavery in this country. Do you think Stephen A. Douglas clearly understood the slavery issue from all points of view in 1850? Stephen A. Douglas, no person understands everything from all points of view. Douglas was, as I said in the class, a Western nationalist, you might almost say. He was not pro-slavery. He understood the political power of slavery. He was in the Democratic Party where the slave owners had a tremendous, influence. Douglas understood slavery was a divisive issue. He understood that it was standing in the way of things that were important to him, like Western development. But what he didn't understand, I think, was since he had no particular moral sentiment about slavery one way or the other. Remember, his whole position was, I don't care what they do. It's not my business what their position, what the South does on slavery, or even the territories. I don't care if they voted up or voted down. That's not my problem. He didn't see the moral issue involved, and he didn't see the power of other people having that moral concern about slavery. So I think, he had some blind spots, but all politicians have blind spots. And he was a very successful politician for most of the 1850s. Douglas was trying to find a compromise, a middle ground between anti-slavery and pro-slavery. And like many others who tried that, he just got ground to bits between those two large forces. All right, we're back to black slave owners. Were they more kind to their slaves? Nope. Not to my knowledge. I don't think they were more or less kind. Well, it's two different kinds. The people who own their own families, that's a whole different thing, right? Dubuclet, who owned, I don't think he was he treated his slaves any differently than anyone else. They were a factor of production, you might say. The job was to get them to work. You could get slaves to work by treating them kindly. You could get slaves to work by treating them very brutally. Each owner had his own concept of how to get slaves to work. But I don't think black slave owners were necessarily any particularly different, the big ones, from white slave owners. Do you teach other courses? Well, this current MOOC is the first of 3 that are going all this academic year. So after our MOOC is over in about 4 weeks or whatever it is, then we will all take a break. And then MOOC number 2 will come on probably in January. Which is about the Civil War itself. And then after that's finished, we'll take a break. And then MOOC number 3 will come on in the spring on the Reconstruction period. So yeah, I'm mentioning that for the future, but right now we're in the coming of the Civil War. But this is part of a longer range account of the whole Civil War Reconstruction era. All right, if I recall correctly, there was some discussion on how a Civil War in the 1850s would have been different from the historical timeline. A civil war in the 1850s. Well, it's almost the 1850s. This is total speculation. What if a civil war had broken out in 1850, when there was a bitter controversy in Congress over these issues, eventually settled, at least temporarily, by the Compromise of 1850, as you know. But what would have happened if a civil war broken out in 1850? I have no idea. I mean, we have enough problem figuring out what did happen than to try to figure out what didn't happen. But this is totally circular, but because a civil war didn't break out, we can say the circumstances or the context for a civil war were not yet present. The South would have probably had a greater advantage because the North was not nearly as industrialized in 1850 as it would be in 1860, and therefore the kind of imbalance of economic power between North and South was lesser on that ground in 1850 and 1860. But people weren't thinking of that. No one was saying, hey, well, if we wait 10 years, there'll be more industry. Obviously, nobody knows how that would work out. Are abolitionists our true founding fathers? Well, I said that in class, and that's a kind of provocative statement. I mean it to provoke thought, and I hope it does. When I say the abolitionists are our true founding fathers, what I mean is it was the abolitionists, not the people who wrote the Constitution, who conceived of the America we have today, a multiracial, multicultural society where, at least in law, everybody is equal, right? The founders did not imagine a society like that. They couldn't imagine a biracial or a multiracial society. It's not that they were all racist or pro-slavery, but they had a different vision of what the society would look like, and it was basically a white vision. Good example, in 1790, they passed the first Naturalization Act for immigrants coming from abroad and how they would become citizens. And they said, this is only for white people. We don't want non-whites coming into this country. From Africa, Asia, forget it. We don't want you. Well, that's a picture of what America is or ought to be. The abolitionists had a different picture. They said these slaves are Americans. They ought to be freed and become equal members of American society. So, that's what I mean by saying they were the founders, because they were the founders of a country grounded in equality, which did not exist before the Civil War. What differentiates slavery in the American colonies from other kinds of slavery? How many hours do you have for this? The historical sociologist Orlando Patterson wrote a book years ago about slavery, in which he kind of classified some 200 and some odd different systems of slavery. This is a sad commentary on human existence, isn't it? Ever since, as far back as you go in human records, there is slavery. Slavery has always existed. Something wrong with human beings in some respect. But so how did our system differ? It differed enormously, but there were two particular kinds of difference that was so important in our society. One, American slavery was plantation slavery. Most slavery before this was not. It was household slavery, where an owner would own one or two slaves working in the house or working in a farm. But now it's plantation slavery, which means you have a vast number of slaves working in very regimented conditions, producing a crop for the world market. It's much more important economically. It produces much more wealth for the owners, and it requires much more heavy policing and discipline because the slaves outnumber the whites by such a large amount. And secondly, of course, slavery in the US is racial slavery. We're so used to that being an essence of slavery that we don't even remember. Most slavery is not racial slavery. They had slavery in Africa. There was no racial difference between the slave and the owner. They had slavery in the Roman Empire. Probably the greatest slave system before the American South was the Roman system of slavery. There was no racial difference between the owner and the slave there. The result of that was that if a slave became free, they could integrate into the society. They didn't bear the mark of slavery on their person visibly. there was no racism accompanying slavery. Whereas in the United States, you have a whole ideology of racism that grows up in order to justify the system of slavery. So that's a very big difference. That happens all over the Western Hemisphere, but it's a very big difference between that and other systems of slavery that have existed at various points in human history. I've been reading the John Ashworth book. Surprised he's British. He is British. Is there a lot of serious scholarship in the American Civil War by non-American historians? What sort of impact have they had? That's a good question. Yeah, Ashworth's a good friend of mine. He's definitely British. Believe me, he's got a thick accent. But he was teaching, he just retired. I think he was in one of those universities in Northern England, Northampton. I don't know. Anyway, you know, there are so many people doing American history in the US that people doing it abroad get a little bit overshadowed, which is unfortunate because people from abroad can often have a different perspective on American history. I mean, we could start with de Tocqueville, you know. He came over in the 1830s and wrote a book about America, which people are still reading. Ashworth, William Brock, a very fine British scholar of Reconstruction, very influential. Ashworth is widely read in the US. Raimondo Loraghi, an Italian military historian, wrote a very good book on the American Civil War. Unfortunately, it's only in Italian. It's never been translated. But Loraghi's book is excellent. But there aren't all that many. I mean, I think the thrust of the question is probably correct. There are so many people doing this work in the US that it's very hard for people from outside to kind of get a foothold in this kind of study. So there's some of them are very good, but they tend to get overshadowed by US-based historians. To what extent are there well-known businesses today which have their roots or connection with slavery? Yeah, that's a good question because it's sort of faded out now. But in the 10 years ago or something like that, there were demands that many companies kind of look into their connections with slavery. So, for example, Brooks Brothers. This may even be a Brooks Brothers shirt I'm wearing. I don't know. Brooks Brothers, very well-known clothier. Well, yeah, before the Civil War, Brooks Brothers was in existence, and they were selling what they called slave cloth to the South. Fairly simple and rudimentary cloth out of which clothing for slaves would be made. They had a big market in the South, so they were making money off of slavery, no question about it. Now, the problem is businesses combine, they're taken over, they change their name. You know, there's very few businesses that exist in the same form today as they did in 1840, let's say. So one could track banks or insurance companies that were dealing with slavery and track out, you know, they've been taken over by this guy or merged with that one. And so it's not really the same thing, but there are elements of it around. And so, yes, there are such businesses today that were very deeply involved in slavery, but it's hard to track the genealogy of that because business itself has changed so much over the past 150 years or so. If the roles were reversed and it was the North who had the slaves and the South who did not, did the Civil War still have occurred? You know, Lincoln, in his great Peoria speech of 1854, said something to the effect that he said, you know, he said, he said, if we were in the South, we would be owning slaves. And if these Southerners were in the North, they wouldn't. So it's not individual fault we're talking about here. It's the nature of the society. Now, to answer this question, you have to imagine a million other things. That's the problem with counterfactual history, because it's not just one thing. What kind of slavery would be existing in the North? You couldn't have had plantation systems in the North. Industrial slavery? I don't know. What kind of free labor would be existing in the South? In other words, the speculative aspect of this question is so great that it's almost impossible to answer. But if you believe, as I do, that the existence of slavery creates a particular outlook, ideology, politics, way of looking at the world, and the existence of free labor creates a different ideology and outlook, then you'd say a clash of some kind is inevitable, whether it's north, south, east, west, it doesn't matter. It's the underpinning of the society and the values and the ideas that kind of flow out of that that is pushing the country toward this crisis. In your opinion, why is there so much interest in the Civil War, and why does it seem so misunderstood? Well, that's a great question, and many of us have thought about that. Yeah, the Civil War does have a perennial interest. Thousands of people go out there to reenact Civil War battles. That's not something I find interesting or somehow appealing, but people do it. There are Civil War forums in every town in the country where they meet and talk about issues and have speakers. I've spoken at quite a few of them. That's great that people are, I'm a historian. I think it's great that people are interested in history. The problem with the Civil War is that very often the interest gets to be, you might say, very antiquarian. They're interested in the weaponry. They're interested in the uniforms. They're interested in the military strategy, the conduct of battles. But very often they're interested in how people were fighting, but not why people were fighting. What was this all about anyway? And they need to expand their horizon a little bit. Now, many of them do. I'm not criticizing everyone who's interested in the Civil War, but a lot of the interest, as I say, is this antiquarian battle interest. So, now, is the Civil War misunderstood, as the question says? Well, many features of history are misunderstood. Reconstruction is even more misunderstood than the Civil War. We will get to that down the road. But I think, yeah, there is a lot of misunderstanding. The biggest historical error, if you want to call it that I encounter all the time is the notion that slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War. The Civil War is about states' rights. That's why the South seceded, states' rights. Now, there's some truth in that, of course. Southerners were very attentive to states' rights, particularly because of the right to own slaves, which was created by state law. Not the federal government didn't create slavery, it's the states that created it and regulated it and created the laws of slavery. So states' rights is a defense of slavery. However, if that's the case, how do you explain the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850? The biggest imposition of federal power on the states in the whole period before the Civil War, in the interest of slavery, overriding all sorts of procedures in the North, invalidating Northern laws trying to deal with fugitive slaves, federal intervention in the states to capture and return fugitive slaves. One may say, all right, that's their right, but that certainly has nothing to do with states' rights. That's a violation of states' rights. And but it's slavery that, when it comes to slavery, they're willing to agree with or support vigorous national action as well as, so, that's a misunderstanding. I think it's common out there, but, I'm glad that so many people are interested in the Civil War fundamentally. While slavery is an abhorrent institution, my question is, would the nation be where it is today without it, without slavery? Many great nations were built on the back of slaves, ancient Egypt, with enslaved Israelites, slave Chinese building the Great Wall. Yeah, as I said, slavery is right. Well, would the nation be in the same state? This is a moral question as much as a historical question. And let us say, no, let us say that slavery produced a lot of wealth, which helped build up the country. Therefore, what? Therefore, it was good to have slavery? Well, then why don't we have it again today? We could have even more wealth, and look at the legacies of slavery in racism, in inequality between African Americans and whites. These are legacies of slavery into our own time. So, slavery may have produced wealth, but it also produced a sickness in American society, which still is visible today. And that maybe not as prominently as in the 19th century, but it certainly hasn't been totally overcome. And so, I think one has to be very careful going down that route. I remember somebody said, oh, well, hey, without the Holocaust, there would not be the state of Israel. All right. Well, does that mean Jews should celebrate the Holocaust? Because without it, there wouldn't be the state of Israel? No, I think we have to keep a moral compass and say there are certain things which are intolerable regardless of the practical consequences of them in terms of wealth or power or something like that. What impact did societal groups have in the discussion surrounding the abolition of slavery? I'm not quite sure what you mean by societal groups. Different elements of society certainly, by the 1850s, the issue of slavery was being debated all over the place. Churches debated it, other organizations, societal groups, if that's what you mean, were deeply involved in discuss. Churches split. The Baptist Church, the Methodist Church split into northern and southern wings in this era because they could not agree on the question of slavery. So that issue wormed its way into societal groups and often divided them, just like it divided the politics and many other features of the society. Is there historical evidence of the Africans who sold African slaves to Europeans? Of course, tremendous amount of evidence. Africans, it is completely true that there was slavery in Africa before the European penetration there, and much of the sale of slaves was in the control of African merchants and African kings. Not so much in southern Africa, like in Angola, Congo, where the Portuguese were. They kind of took over everything. But in the west, the western coast of Africa, where the British were and the Dutch, they didn't get very far on shore. It was Africans who were doing this, and wars among African peoples. What does that prove? What does that prove? It proves that mankind is capable of all sorts of errors. That class conflict is another thing. Well-to-do Africans sold other Africans into slavery. There's no question about that. Does that justify slavery in the West? No, of course it doesn't. And it was the British, particularly, and other Westerners who organized the Atlantic slave trade, which tremendously exacerbated an existing slave system and a slave trade in Africa. So yeah, there's been a lot of study of the mechanisms of the slave trade on the coast of Africa and how African rulers profited from it and African merchants profited from it. Although the tide could be turned, there were African merchants who were selling slaves, and then one day they're captured and sold into slavery themselves. The thing is, what's ironic about this question is even to call them Africans is a misnomer. They lived on a continent of Africa, but they were not Africans in any conscious sense. They were members of different groups. They were Igbo, they were, Ashanti. They were warring with each other. It's just like Native Americans, Indians. Did they all consider themselves Indian? No, of course, that concept didn't exist. When white people came over, the first thing Indians thought was, how am I going to use these guys against my enemies? How am I going to make alliance with these newcomers to fight the Indians I'm always fighting? What about Europeans? If you're going to say, how could Africans have sold their own people into Africa, into slavery? How could Europeans have massacred 6 million of themselves? Germans and Jews were Europeans. They're as much Europeans as Africans are Africans. Living on the same continent does not make you the same people, is my point. So, these kind of conflicts exist all over the place, and one shouldn't be surprised that is the case. I've always been interested in the constitutionality of secession. Yeah, good luck in figuring that out. It seems to me that just as no state can be forced to join the Union, no state can be obliged to remain in it. Lincoln disagreed. Was he right? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, and Lincoln was a pretty good lawyer, but the people who wrote the Constitution did not envision secession. There is nothing in the Constitution about how a state can leave the Union. It doesn't say you got to have a vote, you got to get approval of, no, there's nothing. They did not envision secession. So therefore, the Constitution says nothing about it. There is no constitutional discussion of secession. So I don't know where that leaves us. It's just not on the minds of the people who wrote the Constitution. They certainly didn't envision 11 states waging war against the rest of the country. That's something they couldn't have conceived of in their wildest dreams. So there's nothing in the Constitution about that either. So, if like Lincoln said, hey, the Union is meant to be permanent. This is a permanent Union. You can't leave. Other people said, no, it's like a contract. I don't want to be bound by this contract. I'm giving it up. So maybe let's not think about the original 13 states. Let's talk about Louisiana. How did Louisiana get into the Union? We bought it from the French, right? Well, what gives them the right to leave them? We bought them. We bought that territory. The United States bought it. Where do they get the right to leave in that case? Or the Mexican cession. Do they have a right to leave? We bought it, basically, or conquered it from Mexico. What about the money we paid for Louisiana? We get that back? I mean, in other words, the questions just keep multiplying in ways that nobody anticipated. So to ask whether Lincoln was right or not is really unanswerable. Unfortunately, the question of secession was decided in the Civil War. The Civil War decided, no, you can't secede. That wasn't a constitutional resolution. That was manpower, war. They lost, so they can't secede. If they'd won, they could secede. That's the constitutional issue. All right, we're getting close. We have 5 more minutes, so we'll take a few more of these questions. And now we get to the current moment. Discuss your article on the Nation on how Bernie said, yeah, Bernie, my letter to Bernie. I've never met Bernie, by the way. I'm sure he doesn't know I exist, but I got annoyed at the Democratic debate. I kind of like Bernie, actually. I think it's very good that this issue of economic inequality is being forced onto the political agenda in a way that no one else had been willing to do until Bernie got out there talking about it. But I sort of was taken aback in the last debate where when people asked him, what does democratic socialism mean, he talked about Denmark. And, I actually teach a course here at Columbia periodically on the history of American radicalism. And this is an American idea. It's not that. Forget about Denmark. Nobody in the United States cares what the hell is going on in Denmark. Let's face it. I mean, they got good beer there. I visited Copenhagen, Carlsberg. You can go to their factory. Very nice. But that's not a model for the U.S. I mean, they did some pretty cool things, and we could learn from them, and they could learn some things from us, too. But this is an indigenous American ideal of equality, of opportunity. He should be talking about Eugene Debs. He should be talking about Frederick Douglass. He should be talking about Susan B. Anthony. He should not be playing inadvertently to the idea that these are foreign ideologies which somehow get infiltrated into the United States. No, these are American values that he's talking about. And I would much rather have him quote William Lloyd Garrison than the Prime Minister of Denmark. This is not that I'm a nationalist or that we can't learn anything from other countries. We should learn things from other countries. But that doesn't mean that we just have to adopt whole hog the idea that these are foreign ideas. So that was my letter to Bernie. I just got annoyed. I wrote it out. I gave it to the Nation. It got an amazing amount of attention. I couldn't believe it. All these people tweeting it around all over the place. The other day, Bernie put out as a tweet, William Lloyd Garrison, I will not equivocate. I will not surrender. I will be forthright, and I will be heard. Good for Bernie. William Lloyd Garrison's our man, not the Prime Minister of Denmark. That was my view. All right, let's see. We have time for one more question, I guess. So let's see what it is. Are there still big questions and debates remain unanswered about the Civil War? Good question. I'm sure there are, and I'm not even sure what they are, really. I mean, every generation of historians comes up with new questions, new perspectives. I'm the older generation now. Hard for me to say that, but it's true. There are young scholars. I think one of the interesting tendencies right now is what they call putting American history in an international or global context. So people are looking at the international dimensions of the Civil War. They're comparing the Civil War. Their book just came out comparing the American Civil War to the war taking place at the same time, more or less, in South America, the War of the Triple Alliance, where I guess it was Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay were attacking Paraguay. I don't even know what the issue was, but it was a very bloody war just at the same time as the war in the US. And so there was it's not the same thing, obviously, but there were parallels in terms of strategy, technology, manpower losses. So there are ways of sort of gaining more. Then there's the whole idea of national consolidation, the Civil War as this unification of the nation. And that's going on in other countries too. Germany, Bismarck is unifying Germany. Cavour is unifying Italy. The Meiji Restoration in Japan is creating a much more powerful central government. Is this just coincidence? Maybe it is. Or is the American Civil War sort of part of a larger process going on in other countries? It's hard to know how to answer a question like that. But I think, and also, of course, the end of slavery, comparing the end of slavery in the U.S. Every other country that had slavery also abolished it, What happened? How was it abolished? What happened next? What was the status of the former slaves after slave, whether it's Brazil or Cuba or the British Caribbean or other such places? So I think this international perspective is a useful addition. It's not going to replace the internal analysis of the Civil War, but it's a very useful conceptual addition to getting a broad perspective on it. All right, it's 8 o'clock. The World Series is beginning. The Republican debate is beginning. We will stop. So thank you all for taking part.